Good morning, class. Good morning, everyone. Uh, are you able to hear me loud and clear? Please let me know. Are you able to hear me loud and clear? Okay, I was asked to make one announcement. Is my video it's going on without buffering? Okay, your attendance will be marked as per session. That is as per live session, not through the YouTube, or you can't mark your attendance later on. So your attendance will be marked on live sessions. So please note this down, and we'll start with our topic for today is pulmonary embolism. It's a very interesting topic. First, you have to know what is pulmonary embolism. Pulmonary embolism is something like a very common and a preventable complication in it is mostly found in hospitalized patients, and it is one of the cause of sudden death in hospitalized patient. One of the very common preventable condition in a hospitalized patients, mostly in the post-operative patients. So it is basically a kind of peripheral artery disease where the affecting arteries can be in the neck, in the abdomen, in the extremity, and it basically blocks the embolism. Pulmonary embolism, as the word says, pulmonary stand for the lungs, and the embolism is it's a thrombus. As the thrombus moves to the different part of the vasculature. So pulmonary embolism is the blockage of pulmonary arteries either by a thrombus or a fat or emboli or tumor tissue. So anything which goes and blocks the pulmonary vasculature, it is supposed to be a pulmonary embolism. It is one of the most common preventable complication in the hospitalized patient. And embolus is, as you know, it's basically a thrombus or a clot or a plug, and it is basically carried out by the bloodstream from its point of origin to a small blood vessels, and once it gets lodged in the peripheral blood vessels, which is distant from the source of origin, it goes and obstruct the circulation. That is the main pathophysiology, as we'll talk later in the slides. Virtually all pulmonary embolism develop from thrombi, obviously, and that thrombi most commonly is due to, it can originate in deep calf muscles, in superficial veins, and in the lower extremities, the proximal vessels in the lower extremities, especially femoral, popliteal, and ileal. These are the very common of the commonest vessels where the thrombus grow. And the other sources are actually fat, bone marrow, even amniotic fluid, septic thrombi, that is born out of sepsis, then vegetations in the heart vessels. They also have a tendency to emboli. But 90 to 95% cases of pulmonary embolism, they have a etiology through mostly through the deep vein thrombosis, or even to some extent superficial vein thrombosis, and mostly the deep vein thrombosis, and from the thrombus mostly in the lower extremities and even in the upper extremities. And the major operations like hip, knee, abdominal, extensive pelvic procedures, uh, they are the major operation which predispose the patient to thrombus formation, as we'll talk in later in the slides about the virtue stride and everything. Then one important thing is traveling, like long distance flight, or even in a cramped up space. If even it is written in Harrison, even if you're watching TV for a long time and without moving your legs. So, with definitely with certain predisposed factors present, eh, these people have tendency for stasis and clotting of blood in their blood vessels, especially in the peripheral vessels, and they might go for pulmonary embolism. So that's why when on a long distance flight, there is a repeated announcement that you should keep moving your legs and keep stretching. So the most common source of embolism are proximal leg deep vein thrombosis, or pelvic vein thrombosis. What is important to note down, even venous thromboembolism can take place in superficial veins and even in uh, other larger veins like renal veins and saphenous veins. So any risk factor for DVT we have to rule out, because that will increase the risk for venous clot to dislodge and migrate to the lungs, and the whole continuum is termed venous thromboembolism as such, because it starts from the vein and it forms a thrombus and an emboli to the pulmonary vessels. Then the most important thing in the etiology of thrombosis is virtuous stride. What is virtuous stride? You must have read in pathology. Virtuous stride is a stasis in the blood flow, alteration in the endothelium, rather blood vessels or the endothelium, and inflammation or uh, factors affecting the properties of the blood, that is hypercoagulability. Any condition which predisposes to hypercoagulability. We'll talk about it in the continuance in the next few slides. So, talking about the stasis is any alteration in the blood flow, either increase in turbulence or immobilization, whether it's surgical procedure being done and patient is being immobilized for a long period of time, or any injury where again then fracture or any injury where, or in a cases of pregnancy, uh, definitely if the patient is having a procoagulant state, then in cases of obesity, and especially in cancer patient, because cancer is a condition of a very hypercoagulable state, so especially in the cancer patient. The other conditions are like alteration in the blood vessels wall, like any procedures like catheterization causing direct injury, or any trauma which have caused injury to the endothelium, or even sepsis. We talked about the septic shock, which is causing inflammation in the endothelium or injury in the vessel walls, and even those traumatic, even those long orthopedic surgeries like hip replacement or femoral fracture, basically when there is a injury to the blood vessels. And the other factor talked about the hypercoagulability state. The hypercoagulability state can be like women on contraceptives. Historically, OCPs, they used to have a very high content of estrogen. Nowadays, OCPs have a relatively lower content of estrogen. So these hormonal induced coagulable state was very common. Even the risk of thrombosis was very high in the older times. Then certain genetic predisposing factors are there, like factor 5 lead mutation, protein C deficiency, protein S deficiency, antithrombin deficiency, homocystinemia. So these are certain genetic thrombophilic conditions where there is what happens, you have a chances there is a procoagulation state, and the intrinsic and extrinsic factor when we talk about the clotting system, the extrinsic and intrinsic factor. So there is any certain deficiency in any of the factor, or there is a particular mutation in a particular factor. So that intrinsic or intrinsic pathway is being activated, and it predisposed to thrombus formation. Then there are acquired thrombophilic conditions like antiphospholipid syndrome, which is very common, and which is especially in the pregnant woman, where you will have anti-cardiolipid antibody positive. Especially in the pregnant woman, this antiphospholipid syndrome is very common, and that again predispose the patients to thromboembolic events. Nephrotic syndrome, as you know, nephrotic syndrome, it has again the tendency to cause prothrombotic state. Then cancer, obviously, because of secretion of procoagulants. So clinical features. Clinical features. We'll talk about pathophysiology first. When we go to clinical features, so we can relate both the things. So as the emboli travels to the lungs, what happens? It lodges in the pulmonary vasculature, and depend on the size and number of emboli, the site of embolization. I mean, there is a grading for pulmonary embolism is something like acute, subacute, or a massive or a submassive. So it depends on the number of emboli and the size of the emboli and the site of the emboli. So as the blood flow is obstructed, obviously when the blood flow is obstructed, there will decrease in leading perfusion of the vasculature. So as the perfusion decreases, there will be, as the patient continues to ventilate that particular portion of the lung, there will be, as the tissue is not perfused, so there will be hypoxemia, there will be ventilation perfusion mismatch. And even when the emboli lodges in the large pulmonary vessels, especially because of the hypoxemia, the patient tends to hyperventilate, and there will be subsequent hypoxemia, and there are chances there will be subsequent hypoxemia induced secretion of inflammatory cytokines, as well as increase in pulmonary vascular resistance. There will be increase in PVR, pulmonary vascular resistance, and that will again increase the pressure, and it will further cause pulmonary shunting, the perfusion shunting, and will further enhance the ventilation perfusion mismatch, and then it eventually will cause pressure on the right ventricles. And because it's an acute condition, and the right ventricles have a very restricted capacity to compensate for the pressure, for the kind of pressure which is generated in the pulmonary vasculature, so it tends to fail, and there will, in tendency, it tends to fail, and because of the increased pressure on the right ventricle wall, there will be shifting of the right ventricular septum into the left ventricular septum, and that will eventually leads to reduced cardiac output. So as the output is reduced, blood pressure might be reduced. So the whole cycle of hypoxemia will exaggerate. So if the embolism happens in the small vessel, there will be less traumatic manifestation, but perfusion will still be altered, and subsequently it might transform into a larger, transfuse into a larger complications. So as I said, as the arterial constrict, because of platelet regranulation, release of, there will be certain histamines, serotonins, catecholamines, prostaglandins, and there will be pulmonary vasculature, vasoconstriction. One important point to note down: the hypoxemia causes vasodilation in the normal human tissue, except for the pulmonary vessels, where it causes vasoconstriction. So this vasoconstriction causes a major role in hemodynamic instability, as we talked about. So as the pressure is increased, the workload of the right ventricle increase, and they can lead to cardiopulmonary collapse. There will be lack of perfusion, there will be hypoxia, there can be, because of hypotension, metabolic acidosis. Because of hyperventilation, there can be respiratory alkalosis with decrease in carbon dioxide, and further patient may land up in acute code pulmonale, that is failure of the right side of the ventricles. So clinical features, talking about the clinical features, mostly it usually the most common in a post-operative patients, and clinical features depend on, as I talked about, on the size of the emboli, the site of the emboli, and the kind of blood vessel or the pulmonary vasculature which is occluded. So the most common manifestation, the patient will be absolutely he will be all right for first 2 days post-operative, and suddenly on the third day he will have a sudden onset dyspnea, and that will be accompanied with tachycardia or tachypnea. And then if the embolism is massive, there will be a loss of blood pressure, and there might be a pleuritic chest pain. Patient will complain of a pleuritic chest pain because of the associated pulmonary infarction or pleural inflammation. There will be persistent cough. There can be cough, and even because of the pulmonary infarction, there can be a hemoptysis also. But this is not a very usual presentation as such. And there can be crackers. There can be a certain amount of alveolar exudates as the inflammation ensues. So there can be even crackers there. There can be, because of the ensuing inflammation, there can be accompanying fever. Then on auscultatory finding, you will find increased P2, increased pulmonary heart sound, and usually there will be wide or variable splitting of the second heart sound. And because of the hypoxemia, there can be and the low in blood pressure, there can be sudden change in the mental status. In massive emboli, very important to note it down. This in the massive emboli, the features will come very quickly before you could actually understand what's the real cause. So that will lead to shock, pallor, cyanosis, crushing chest pain can be so severe, will be analogous to anginal or a pain, something which happens in MI. And the pulse will be, as I said, will be rapid and weak, and breathing will be patient will be hyperventilating and shallow breathing. Blood pressure will be low, and ECG will show the right ventricular strain. Again, the medium size and the small size, especially talking about the small emboli, patient might land up in the chronic code pulmonale or pulmonary hypertension, and he might manifest after a while. So diagnostic studies in pulmonary embolism, the history and examination is very important, but that doesn't confirm the diagnosis. Only after ruling out the differential diagnosis, then you have to do ABG, air blood gas analysis. Chest X-ray is again one of the complementary diagnostic tool. Then ECG is another one of the tool. CBC with WBC differential, D-dimer. Then you have this ventilation perfusion scan, that is lung scan, and then pulmonary angiography, which has a historical importance now because because it is a very invasive procedure. Then CT angiography which is being proposed nowadays. That is an investigation of choice or a gold standard right now. So first of all, whenever you have a case, you are suspecting pulmonary embolism, there's something called a modified Wells criteria. So you have to clinically assess the patient. You have a scoring system to a particular symptoms, and like you have any patient with like a patient with clinical signs and symptoms of DVT, like he have a swelling of the legs and there is a palpation of the deep veins. That is, such patients are they are given a point score of 3. If there is you have no alternative diagnosis other than pulmonary embolism, then again that is a score of 3. If your heart rate greater than 100, that stands for the score of 1.5. If you have a surgery where there is immobilization for a long period, then you can there is a score of 1.5. Then if a patient who has a history of DVT or pulmonary embolism, he will have a score of 1.5. And if a patient has if a patient has the symptom of hemoptysis, you will assign a score of 1 for them. And if there is any malignancy or patient being treated in the last 6 months, you will assign the score of 1 again. So any unlikely PE is when you have a score of less than 4, and then you have to undertake uh, you have to undertake a particular algorithm when you have a PE score of less than 4. And whenever you have modified well PE score more than 4, so you can straight away go and get a CT pulmonary angiography done to confirm your diagnosis before starting on the treatment. So there's one important thing which is again of historical importance, that is alveolar arterial oxygen gradient. So alveolar arterial oxygen gradient that we talked about, this is a difference in the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the partial pressure of difference in the artery. And the gradient is only 15 to 20 is considered greater than 5 to 10 is normal, and greater than that is considered abnormal. So as I talked about, it is all due to the ventilation perfusion mismatch. You have increase in alveolar and arterial oxygen gradient. Then ECG is a very interesting finding on ECG. You will find a deep S wave in lead 1 and deep Q wave in lead 3, and they will find a T inversion in precordial leads or lead 3. So this is a very interesting finding which is very specific for PVT, for pulmonary thromboembolism, but it is not very common. The most common is finding is tachycardia and T inversions in precordial leads. Then X-ray, there are certain things which will be marked on X-rays apart from the elevated diaphragm or in cardiomegaly because of the chronic PE. There may be associated pleural effusion. There will be oligemia. There will be maybe a patchy oligemia that because of the hypoperfusion. That is being seen on X-ray as a Westermarck sign, and there might be a prominent central pulmonary artery which is called Pala sign or a Fleischer sign. Then there will be opacity on the peripheral area of the lungs, which the base on the pulmonary pleural side and apex towards the vessels. So that is a pleural base area of increased opacity, which is called Hampton's hump. So this is how the Hampton's hump is. It is a kind of where you can see it's a wedge-shaped opacity with the pleural based. You have this a wedge-shaped opacity with the apex on the in line with the pulmonary vasculature and the base on the pleural side. Then Westermarck sign. This is the Westermarck sign. It shows off as a area of hypoxemia. So another important diagnosis, supplementary diagnosis, is sonography. It's called lower limb venous system sonography, or and Doppler. And when you will find thrombus, you can visualize thrombus on the sonography, as it is all the thrombus seen around the blood vessel. Then this is a ventilation. There is something called ventilation perfusion mismatch. And this is again not done nowadays. It's again of a very historical importance, where you will get a ventilation perfusion mismatch, VQ mismatch. It is being again done in cases where you have suspicion of embolism, but it is now not being done nowadays. And then CT pulmonary angiography. This is the method investigation of choice, and you can see this is the pulmonary vessels. This is the right one and this is the left. This is the right pulmonary artery, this is the left pulmonary artery, and you can see the thrombus. This is the thrombus. So this is almost obstructing almost the whole lumen of the right pulmonary artery, and this thrombus is present on both the sides. You can see this thrombus present on both the branches of the pulmonary artery. And this pulmonary angiography, but this is not being done nowadays because it's an invasive procedure, and it shows the these clots, this present, you can see the clots in the pulmonary vasculatures. Because again, the pulmonary angiography, it makes a visual presentation of the pulmonary vasculature, and you need a specialist with a lot of experience to actually read this pulmonary angiography. And because pulmonary embolism, since it doesn't give us much time to react, it's absolute an emergency condition, so we do away with this such tests like pulmonary angiography. Then other test I haven't talked about is cardiac enzymes, because there is cardiac enzymes in echocardiography. And echocardiography wise, you will find right ventricle strain, because the pressure on the right ventricle is increased. So you will find the right ventricle, the right ventricle tends to dilate. The size of the right ventricle might be more than the left ventricle, and because of the enhanced pressure on the right ventricle due to pulmonary artery pressure, you will find there is a septal deviation, right ventricle septal deviation into the left ventricle. And subsequently you will have hypokinesia of the right ventricle, hypokinesia, and that can lead to right ventricle failure, right heart failure. And there will be subsequent hyperkinesia of the apex of the right ventricle, and this is being known as McConnell sign. And there is another, apart from that, you have this then you have cardiac troponin. This is the cardiac enzyme which is raised in numerous conditions, especially in myocardial infarction. So so that's how it mimic the right cardiac troponin will be increased because of the right ventricle strain. And since the right ventricle dilates, it increases in size, it compresses the coronary vessels, and there will be mixed picture of microinfarction, and that will lead to increase in cardiac enzymes, especially cardiac troponin level. And as we address the problem, it tends to decrease after a period of time. But that's how it mimics right myocardial infarction, right ventricle myocardial infarction. So if you are suspecting a PE, the algorithm is how would you chase a patient with PE? How will you process your investigations? Any case of suspected PE, you will start with first of all, if it's a high risk PE, you have a high risk factors, and when modified Wells score is greater than 4, and everything is clinically and history wise is pertaining to pulmonary embolism, then you will straight away get an echo and CT pulmonary angiography done. And if it is a suspected intermediate low risk chances, then apart from Wells score, you have to assess clinically. And if the Wells score is less than 4 and clinically there is very ambiguous suspicion of pulmonary embolism, then you will get a D-dimer done. And for the D-dimer, it has a very strong negative predictive value. Not exactly the strong, it doesn't have a very strong positive predictive value, but it's a very strong negative predictive value. So any negative D-dimer rules out pulmonary embolism eventually. And if it's positive, and you get a CTPA done, and you can confirm your diagnosis. And when the score is greater than VE, again you have to get a CTPA. Ventilation proficient mismatch is not being preferred nowadays, because you have a very convenient and a very confirmatory CT pulmonary angiography test which is available and which can be done in very less time. So you will prefer getting a CTPA done. So the management part, when you talk about the management part, I think this is beyond the scope of your RAM, I think. But anyway, we'll talk about the management part. You should know you have normal general medical measures, especially the resuscitative measures when the patient is very serious or is in ICU, and any post-operative a patient was very normal and suddenly he falls dyspneic and his saturation dropped, and such patient have to be shifted in ICU as soon as possible, or his blood pressure dropped. So such patients, first you bring them into ICU, get all the probes, cardiac monitoring done, get an air blood gas analysis done. We start with an oxygen, give then give a challenge IV, get an IV access, and give them a challenge IV fluid. And it has to be monitored very carefully when you give intravenous fluid, because of chances of right ventricular, because already you have you have chances of right ventricular failure. So you have to monitor your IV fluid, and start with the other general management like morphine and analgesia and sedatives. And the patient is in a cardiogenic shock, you have to start with inotropes like dopamine, noradrenaline, dopamine. And the patient is crashing down, then you might have to intubate the patient and put him on a ventilator. So this is a hemodynamic. This is for hemodynamically unstable patient. So the patient might present to you in basically in two conditions: is he will be hemodynamically stable or he will be hemodynamically unstable. So that I'm talking about this because that is how the treatment modality is being conferred. So treatments, you have anticoagulation, thrombolysis, intra-arterial or catheter-based thrombolysis, interventional clot disruption, or surgical embolectomy. So ECMO is an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. Anticoagulation, you have heparin, you have a low molecular weight heparin, and then you have warfarin, which is again an anticoagulant, oral anticoagulant. And then you have non-vitamin K dependent oral anticoagulants. Then thrombolysis is a treatment of choice for an unstable patient, mostly a patient with a massive pulmonary thromboembolism, and who are the candidate for thrombolysis, for the immediate thrombolysis. It can be done up to 24 hours, and it has its contraindication, and it has adverse effects in the form of intracranial hemorrhage or bleeding in the operative sites. But this is a life-saving. It's a life-saving measure. Then a catheter. There is something called intra-arterial thrombolysis, or a catheter-based thrombolysis, where catheter is being placed in the pulmonary arterial, and the thrombolysis is given in a relatively low and in a direct and a low dose, which is catheter. The thrombolysis is given in a low dose, so that the adverse effects are pretty less, because a higher dose of thrombolysis can cause hemorrhage, especially intracranial hemorrhage, and it can lead to further damage than so the risk to benefit ratio might be altered. So you have to be very careful when giving thrombolysis. There are certain indications and contraindications for thrombolysis. Contraindication, as the absolute contraindication you can't see on this slide properly, I'll tell you. The absolute contraindication is any ICH, any intracranial hemorrhage, any history of intracranial hemorrhage is an absolute contraindication. Any structural intracerebral vascular disease, or any ischemic intracranial CVA for severe stroke within the last 3 months, any surgery, any malignant intracranial neoplasm, if there is suspicion of aortic dissection, or there is active bleeding or bleeding diathesis, or any recent surgery done on spinal or a brain, any major surgery on a brain or a spinal canal. Recent surgery means for last 28 days, or any significant closed head or facial trauma. Relative contraindication, most importantly, any age greater than 75, pregnancy, any current use of anticoagulants, then any prolonged cardiopulmonary resuscitation for more than 10 minutes, or recent internal bleeding, any GI bleed, or any history of severe uncontrolled hypertension, or any ischemic stroke more than 3 months earlier, by any surgery within 3 weeks. These are our relative contraindications. Thrombolysis, I won't talk much about it. The only what important is it is being tried in patient who is hemodynamically unstable, and it is a very faster result, and patient appear to improve clinically very fast, and especially in a massive pulmonary embolism. But it comes with a side effect. Then anticoagulation, mostly any suspected, these are the drugs which can be given prophylactically as well as therapeutically. And anticoagulants are present in form of parental anticoagulants, in the form of heparin and low molecular weight heparin, and then factor 10 inhibitors. As you can remember your clotting pathway, you have extrinsic and intrinsic pathway. As it starts and it then it merges on factor common pathway, that is through factor 10, which goes and activates factor 2, that is prothrombin, and prothrombin gets converted to thrombin, and then fibrinogen is being converted to fibrin. That is how the coagulation mesh is being created. So this rivaroxaban is a factor 10 inhibitor. Then you have apixaban, you have dabigatran. These are the oral anticoagulants. Then you have, of course, you have warfarin, which is a vitamin K dependent anticoagulant. So the what is important is, like, these parental anticoagulants can be used in post-operative cases who have high risk for embolism. They can be used on a prophylaxis basis as well, and these oral anticoagulants can again be used in the therapeutically and prophylactically only after we're trying to shift the patient from parental to oral anticoagulants, or it can be used up to 3 to 6 months, and even in certain conditions it has to be used up to lifetime. Then there's something called, I said, catheter based thrombolysis, where the catheter is being put in the pulmonary artery, and the thrombolysis, like altiplase, tenecteplase, they are being used in a lesser dose so that their side effects are being addressed. There's something I call endovascular procedure, but it is of a very historical importance. And for unstable pulmonary embolism with contraindication to thrombolysis, there is something called surgical embolectomy, but it is being done in a very highly specialized center and by the super specialist, and they have to be very well versed with this therapy. So surgical embolectomy is basically, as the word suggests, it's the embolus is being directly accessed to surgically, and it's being removed. So most important thing is, since I talked about as we started this lecture, this pulmonary embolism is most common preventable. It's a very fatal condition in the post-operative patients. So prophylaxis is very important. If you have then major surgeries being done, or a patient with pregnancy in a hypercoagulable state, you can try something as simple as compressive stockings, or you can give a prophylactic anticoagulants as we talked about, and the management of the other risk factor to be taken care of. This is again some of the recommended prophylaxis, apart from early mobilization, which is as soon as the patient is mobilized. These are the certain recommended prophylaxis, which is beyond the scope of your study right now. So this is all about pulmonary embolism. So if you have any question, please fire through your messages. Let me know your queries through your messages. D-dimer is basically, D-dimer are, as we go into our this clotting mechanism, that's intrinsic and extrinsic pathway, and the thrombin, prothrombin converts into thrombin, then the fibrinogen is converted into fibrin and it forms a mesh, and that fibrin gets, it has a something called D-dimer, which gets, D-dimer is something which gets attached to the fibrin, and then you have something called plasmin. The body uh, try to address, if there is any procoagulable state, the body try to address the problem, and there will be release of plasmin, and this fibrin may break down into small shreds of clots, and that small shreds will have which will have something called D-dimer attached to the fibrins, and that is how when you have this emboli or thrombus, you might have increased level of D-dimer. What is important about D-dimer, it is a strong negative predictive value. So if it's negative, you can almost you can be certain that it's not pulmonary embolism. But if it's positive, you have to suspect pulmonary embolism. So D-dimer is basically, it's a shredded product of fibrin mesh. It's only after coagulation the thrombus is forming, you will have chances of thrombus shreds going around in the blood vessels, and that might manifest as increase in level of D-dimers. But D-dimer is not a very specific test. Any query you have, you can definitely ask in the next class too. You can just type in your messages. So only thing you need to know about pulmonary embolism, it's a preventable, fatal, post-operative complication, and especially in the patient who have history of DVT, or DVT is 90 to 95% the main cause for pulmonary embolism. And the signs and symptoms, as we talked about, investigation of choice is CT pulmonary angiography, and how to approach such patient, what is the basic algorithm we talked about, and we'll recap it in for first 10 minutes. We'll recap this pulmonary embolism in the next class. So thank you so much.